The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 10, Side 1. What a relief to meet a man of sense, ability, and honor. Vespasian, busy directing the war against Judea, took his time in coming to occupy the dangerous eminence that his soldiers had won for him, and which the Senate hurriedly confirmed. When he arrived in October of 70, he set himself with inspiring energy to restore order to a society disturbed in every aspect of its life. Perceiving that he would have to repeat the labors of Augustus, he modeled his behavior and policy upon those of that prince. He made his peace with the Senate and re-established constitutional government. He freed or recalled those who had been convicted of lèse majesté under Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. He reorganized the army, limited the number and power of the Praetorian Guard, appointed competent generals to suppress revolts in the provinces, and was soon able to close the temple of Janus as a sign and pledge of peace. He was 60, but in the unimpaired vigor of his powerful frame. He was built foursquare in body and character, with a broad, bald, and massive head, coarse but commanding features, and small, sharp eyes that pierced every sham. He had none of the stigmata of genius. He was merely a man of firm will and practical intelligence. He had been born in a Sabine village near Rieti, of purely plebeian stock. His accession was a fourfold revolution. A commoner had reached the throne, a provincial army had overcome the Praetorians and crowned its candidate, the Flavians had succeeded the Julio-Claudians, and the simple habits and virtues of the Italian bourgeois replaced, at the court of the emperor, the Epicurean wastefulness of the city-bred descendants of Augustus and Livia. Vespasian never forgot or sought to conceal his modest ancestry. When expectant genealogists traced his family back to a companion of Hercules, he laughed them into silence. Periodically he returned to the home of his birth to enjoy its rustic ways and fare, and he would not allow anything there to be changed. He scorned luxury and laziness, ate the food of peasants, fasted one day in each month, and declared war upon extravagance. When a Roman whom he had nominated for office came to him smelling of perfume, he said, "I would rather you smelled of garlic," and withdrew the nomination. He made himself easily accessible, talked and lived on a footing of equality with the people, enjoyed jokes at his own expense, and allowed everyone great freedom in criticizing his conduct and his character. Having discovered a conspiracy against him, he forgave the plotters, saying that they were fools not to realize what a burden of cares a ruler wore. He lost his good temper in one case only. Helvidius Priscus, restored to the Senate from the exile into which Nero had sent him, demanded the restoration of the Republic, and reviled Vespasian without concealment or restraint. Vespasian asked him not to attend the Senate if he proposed to continue such abuse. Helvidius refused. Vespasian banished him and tarnished an excellent reign by ordering him put to death. He regretted the action later, and for the rest, says Suetonius, showed the greatest patience under the frank language of his friends and the impudence of philosophers. These latter were not so much Stoics as cynics, philosophical anarchists who felt that all government was an imposition and attacked every emperor. To get fresh blood into a Senate depleted by family limitation and civil war, Vespasian secured appointment as censor, brought to Rome 1,000 distinguished families from Italy and the western provinces, enrolled them in the patrician or equestrian orders, and over many bitter protests filled out the Senate from their ranks. The new aristocracy, under the stimulus of his example, improved Roman morals and society. It was not spoiled yet by idle wealth, nor yet so removed from labor and the soil as to disdain the routine tasks of life and administration. It had something of the emperor's order and decency of life. Out of it came those rulers who, after Domitian, gave Rome good government for a century. Conscious of the evils that had flowed from the use of freedmen as imperial executives, Vespasian replaced most of them with men from this provincial infiltration and from Rome's expanding business class. With their help, he accomplished in 9 years a miracle of rehabilitation. He calculated that 40 billion sesterces were needed to transform bankruptcy into solvency. The figure given by Suetonius is often rejected as incredible, but probably it was reckoned in a depreciated currency. To raise this sum, he taxed almost everything, raised the provincial tribute, reimposed it upon Greece, recaptured and let public lands, sold royal palaces and estates, and insisted upon such economy that the citizens denounced him as a miserly peasant. A tax was placed upon even the use of the public urinals that adorned ancient like modern Rome. His son Titus protested against such undignified revenue, but the old emperor held some coins of it to the youth's nose and said, "See, my child, if they smell." Suetonius accuses him of adding to the imperial income by selling offices and by promoting the most rapacious of his provincial appointees so that they might be swollen with spoils when he suddenly summoned them, examined their transactions, and confiscated their gains. The crafty financier, however, used none of the proceeds for himself, but poured them all into the economic recovery, architectural adornment, and cultural advancement of Rome. It remained for this blunt soldier to establish the first system of state education in classical antiquity. He ordered that certain qualified teachers of Latin and Greek literature and rhetoric should thereafter be paid out of public funds and should receive a pension after 20 years of service. Perhaps the old skeptic felt that teachers had some share in forming public opinion and would speak better of a government that paid their way. Probably for like reasons he restored many of the ancient temples, even in rural districts. He rebuilt the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, which had been burned down by the Vitellians over his soldiers' heads, raised a majestic shrine to Pax, the goddess of peace, and began the most renowned of Roman buildings, the Colosseum. The upper classes mourned as they saw their fortunes taxed to provide public works for the state and wages for proletaires, and the workers were not particularly grateful. He roused the people to an energetic campaign of clearing away the debris left by the recent war, and he himself carried the first load. When an inventor showed him plans for a hoisting machine that would greatly reduce the need for human labor in these enterprises of removal and construction, he refused to use it, saying, "I must feed my poor." In this moratorium on invention, Vespasian recognized the problem of technological unemployment and decided against an industrial revolution. The provinces prospered as never before. Their wealth was now twice as great, at least in monetary terms, as under Augustus, and they bore the increased tribute without injury. Vespasian sent the able Agricola to govern Britain, and delegated to Titus the task of ending the revolt of the Jews. Titus captured Jerusalem and returned to Rome with all the honors that usually crown superior killing. A spectacular triumph led a long procession of captives and spoils through the streets, and a famous arch was raised to commemorate the victory. Vespasian was proud of his son's success, but disturbed by the fact that Titus had brought home a pretty Jewish princess, Berenice, as his mistress, and wished to marry her. Again, capta ferum victorem cepit. The emperor could not see why one should marry a mistress. He himself, after the death of his wife, lived with a freedwoman without troubling to wed her. And when this Caenus died, he distributed his love among several concubines. He was convinced that the succession to his power must be settled before his death, as the alternative to anarchy. The Senate agreed, but demanded that he should name and adopt the best of the best, presumably a senator. Vespasian answered that he reckoned that Titus was the best. To ease the situation, the young conqueror dismissed Berenice and sought consolation in promiscuity. The emperor thereupon associated Titus with himself on the throne and delegated to him an increasing share in the government. In 79, Vespasian again visited Rieti. While in the Sabine country, he drank copiously the purgative waters of Lake Utilia and was seized with severe diarrhea. Though confined to his bed, he continued to receive embassies and perform the other duties of his office. Feeling the hand of death upon him, he nevertheless kept his bluff humor. "Vai, puto deus fio," he remarked. "Alas, I think I am becoming a god." Almost fainting, he struggled to his feet with the help of attendants, saying, "An emperor should die standing." With these words he concluded a full life of 69 years and a beneficent reign of 10. 7. Titus. His older son, named like himself Titus Flavius Vespasianus, was the most fortunate of emperors. Titus died in the 2nd year of his rule and the 42nd of his age, while still the darling of mankind. Time did not suffice him for the corruptions of power or the disillusionment of desire. As a youth he had distinguished himself in ruthless war and tarnished his name with loose living. Now, instead of letting omnipotence intoxicate him, he reformed his morals and made his government a model of wisdom and honor. His greatest fault was uncontrollable generosity. He counted that day lost on which he had not made someone happy with a gift. He spent too much on shows and games, and he left the replenished treasury almost as low as his father had found it. He completed the Colosseum and built another municipal bath. No one suffered capital punishment during his brief reign. On the contrary, he had informers flogged and banished. He swore that he would rather be killed than kill. When 2 patricians were detected in a conspiracy to depose him, he contented himself with sending them a warning. Then he dispatched a courier to relieve the anxiety of a conspirator's mother by telling her that her son was safe. His misfortunes were disasters over which he could have little control. A 3-day fire in the year 79 destroyed many important buildings, including again the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. In the same year, Vesuvius buried Pompeii and thousands of Italians, and a year later Rome was stricken with a plague more deadly than any her history had yet recorded. Titus did all he could to lessen the sufferings caused by these calamities. He showed not merely the concern of an emperor, but a father's surpassing love. He died of a fever in 81 in the same farmhouse in which his father had recently passed away. All Rome mourned him, except the brother who succeeded to his throne. 8. Domitian. Of Domitian it is harder to paint an objective portrait than even of Nero. Our chief sources for his reign are Tacitus and the younger Pliny. They prospered under him, but belonged to the senatorial party that engaged with him in a war almost of mutual extermination. To set against these hostile witnesses we have the poets Statius and Martial, who ate or sought Domitian's bread and literally praised him to the skies. Perhaps all 4 were right, for the last of the Flavians, like many of the Julio-Claudians, began like Gabriel and ended like Lucifer. In this respect, Domitian's soul walked with his body. In youth he was modest, graceful, handsome, tall. In later years he had a protruding belly, spindly legs, and a bald head, though he had written a book on the care of the hair. In adolescence he composed poetry. In obsolescence he distrusted his own prose and let others write his speeches and proclamations. He might have been happier had not Titus been his brother. But only the noblest spirits can bear with equanimity the success of their friends. Domitian's jealousy soured into a taciturn gloom, then into secret machinations against his brother. Titus had to beg his father to forgive the younger son. When Vespasian died, Domitian claimed that he had been left partner in the imperial power, but that the emperor's will had been tampered with. Titus replied by asking him to be his partner and successor. Domitian refused and continued to plot. When Titus fell ill, says Dio Cassius, Domitian hastened his death by packing him about with snow. We cannot assess the truth of these stories, nor of those tales of sexual license that have come down to us. That Domitian swam with prostitutes, made the daughter of Titus one of his concubines, and was most profligate and lewd toward women and boys alike. All Latin historiography is present politics, a partisan blow struck for contemporary ends. When we come to the actual policies of Domitian, we find him, in his first decade, surprisingly Puritan and competent. As Vespasian had modeled himself on Augustus, so Domitian seemed to take over the policies and manners of Tiberius. Having made himself censor for life, he stopped the publication of scurrilous lampoons, though he winked at the epigrams of Martial, enforced the Julian laws against adultery, tried to end child prostitution and reduce unnatural vice, forbade the performance of pantomimes because of their indecency, ordered the execution of a Vestal virgin convicted of incest or adultery, and put an end to the practice of castration, which had spread with the rising price of eunuch slaves. He shrank from any form of bloodshed, even the ritual sacrifice of oxen. He was honorable, liberal, and free from avarice. He refused legacies from those who had children, canceled all tax arrears more than 5 years old, and discountenanced delation. He was a strict but impartial judge. He had freedmen secretaries, but kept them on their good behavior. His reign was one of the great ages of Roman building. The fires of 79 and 82 having caused much destruction and destitution, Domitian organized a program of public works to provide employment and distribute wealth. He, too, hoped to reanimate the old faith by beautifying or multiplying its shrines. He raised the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva once more and spent $22 million on its gold-plated doors and gilded roof. Rome admired the result and mourned the extravagance. When Domitian built for himself and his administrative staff an enormous palace, the Domus Flavia, the citizens reasonably complained of the cost, but they raised no voice against the expensive games with which he sought to moderate his Tiberian unpopularity. He dedicated a temple to his father and his brother. He restored the baths and pantheon of Agrippa, the portico of Octavia, the temples of Isis and Serapis. He added to the Colosseum, finished the baths of Titus, and began those that were completed by Trajan. At the same time, he did his doer best to encourage arts and letters. Flavian portrait sculpture reached its zenith in his principate. His coins are of outstanding excellence. To stimulate poetry, he established in 86 the Capitoline Games, which included contests in literature and music. and for these he built a stadium and a music hall in the field of Mars. He gave modest help to the modest talent of Statius and the immodest talent of Martial. He rebuilt the public libraries which had been destroyed by fire and had their contents renewed by sending scribes to copy the manuscripts in Alexandria, another proof that the great library there had lost only a small part of its treasures in the fire started by Caesar. He managed the empire well. He had Tiberius's grim resolution as an administrator, pounced upon peculation, and kept strict watch on all appointees and developments. As Tiberius had restrained Germanicus, so Domitian withdrew Agricola from Britain after that enterprising general had led his armies and pushed the frontier to Scotland. Apparently Agricola wished to go farther, and Domitian demurred. The recall was attributed to jealousy, and the emperor paid a heavy price for it when the history of his reign was written by Agricola's son-in-law. He was equally unfortunate in war. In 86 the Dacians crossed the Danube, invaded the Roman province of Moesia, and defeated Domitian's generals. The prince took command, planned his campaign well, and was about to enter Dacia when Antoninus Saturninus, Roman governor of Upper Germany, persuaded 2 legions at Mainz to proclaim him emperor. The revolt was suppressed by Domitian's aides, but it disconcerted his strategy by allowing the enemy time to prepare. He crossed the Danube, met the Dacians, and apparently suffered a reverse. He made peace with Decebalus, the Dacian king, sent him an annual douceur, and returned to Rome to celebrate a double triumph over the Chatti and the Dacians. He contented himself thereafter with the building of a limes, or fortified road between the Rhine and the Danube, and another between the northward turn of the Danube and the Black Sea. The revolt of Saturninus was the turning point in Domitian's reign, the dividing line between his better and worse selves. He had always been coldly severe, now he slipped into cruelty. He was capable of good government, but only as an autocrat. The Senate rapidly lost power under him, and his tenacious authority as censor made that body at once subservient and vengeful. Vanity, which flourishes even in the humble, had no check in Domitian's status. He filled the Capitol with statues of himself, announced the divinity of his father, brother, wife, and sisters, as well as his own, organized a new order of priests, the Flaviales, to attend the worship of these new deities, and required officials to speak of him in their documents as Dominus et Deus Noster, our Lord and God. He sat on a throne, encouraged visitors to embrace his knees, and established in his ornate palace the etiquette of an oriental court. The Principate had become, through the power of the army and the decay of the Senate, an unconstitutional monarchy. Against this new development, rebellion rose not only in the aristocracy, but among the philosophers and in the religions that were flowing into Rome from the east. The Jews and the Christians refused to adore the godhead of Domitian, the Cynics decried all government, and the Stoics, though they accepted kings, were pledged to oppose despots and honor tyrannicides. In 89, Domitian expelled the philosophers from Rome. In 95, he banished them from Italy. The earlier edict applied also to the astrologers, whose predictions of the emperor's death had brought new terrors to a mind empty of faith and open to superstition. In 93, Domitian executed some Christians for refusing to offer sacrifice before his image. According to tradition, these included his nephew, Flavius Clemens. In the last years of his reign, the emperor's fear of conspiracy became almost a madness. He lined with shining stone the walls of the porticos under which he walked, so that he might see mirrored in them whatever went on behind him. He complained that the lot of rulers was miserable, since no man believed them when they alleged conspiracy, unless the conspiracy succeeded. Like Tiberius, he listened more readily to informers as he grew older, and as the delatores multiplied, no citizen of any prominence could feel safe from spies, even in his home. After Saturninus's revolt, indictments and convictions rapidly increased. Aristocrats were exiled or killed, suspected men were tortured even by having fire inserted into their private parts. The terrified Senate, including the Tacitus who recounts these events most bitterly, was the agent of trial and condemnation, and at each execution it thanked the gods for the salvation of the prince. Domitian made the mistake of frightening his own household. In 96, he ordered the death of his secretary Epaphroditus because 27 years before he had helped Nero to commit suicide. The other freedmen of the imperial household felt themselves threatened. To protect themselves, they resolved to kill Domitian, and the emperor's wife Domitia joined in the plot. On the night before his last, he leaped from his bed in fright. When the appointed moment came, Domitia's servant struck the first blow. 4 others took part in the assault, and Domitian, struggling madly, met death in the 45th year of his age and the 15th of his reign, this in 96. When the news reached the senators, they tore down and shattered all images of him in their chamber, and ordered that all statues of him and all inscriptions mentioning his name should be destroyed throughout the realm. History has been unfair to this age of despots, because it has spoken here chiefly through the most brilliant and most prejudiced of historians. It is true that the gossip of Suetonius often confirms or follows the invective of Tacitus, but the study of literature and inscriptions has condemned them both as mistaking the vices of 10 emperors for the record of an empire and a century. There was something good in the worst of these rulers: devoted statesmanship in Tiberius, a charming gaiety in Caligula, a plodding wisdom in Claudius, an exuberant aestheticism in Nero, a stern competence in Domitian. Behind the adulteries and the murders, an administrative organization had formed which provided, through all this period, a high order of provincial government. The emperors themselves were the chief victims of their power. Some disease in the blood, fired by the heat of loosed desire, had pursued the Julio-Claudians as fatally as the children of Atreus, and some flaw in the system had debased the Flavians in one generation from patient statesmanship to terrified cruelty. 7 of these 10 men met a violent end. Nearly all of them were unhappy, surrounded by conspiracy, dishonesty, and intrigue, trying to govern a world from the anarchy of a home. They indulged their appetites because they knew how brief was their omnipotence. They lived in the daily horror of men condemned to an early and sudden death. They went under because they were above the law. They became less than men because power had made them gods. But we must not absolve the age or the Principate of its ignominy and its crimes. It had given peace to the empire, but terror to Rome. It had injured morals by the high example of cruelty and lust. It had torn Italy with a civil war more ferocious than that of Caesar and Pompey. It had filled the islands with exiles and had killed off the best and bravest men. It had suborned the treachery of relatives and friends by rewarding avaricious spies. It had in Rome replaced a government of laws with a tyranny of men. It had raised gigantic edifices by accumulating tribute, but it had dwarfed the soul by frightening talented or creative minds into servility or silence. Above all, it had made the army supreme. The power of the prince over the Senate lay not in his superior genius, nor in custom, nor in prestige. It rested upon the pikes of the guard. When provincial armies saw how emperors were made, how rich were the donatives and spoils of the capital, they deposed the praetorians and themselves entered upon the business of making kings. For a century yet the wisdom of great rulers, chosen by adoption rather than by heredity, violence, or wealth, would hold the legions in check and keep the frontiers safe. But when, through a philosopher's love, idiocy would again reach the throne, the armies would run riot, chaos would break through the fragile film of order, and civil war would join hands with the waiting barbarians to topple down the noble and precarious structure of government that the genius of Augustus had built. Chapter 14. The Silver Age, A.D. 14 to 96. 1. The Dilettantes. Tradition has given to Latin letters from A.D. 14 to 117 the name of Silver Age, implying a fall from the cultural excellence of the Augustan age. Tradition is the voice of time, and time is the medium of selection. A cautious mind will respect their verdict, for only youth knows better than 20 centuries. We may be permitted, however, to suspend judgment, to give Lucan, Petronius, Seneca, the elder Pliny, Celsus, Statius, Martial, Quintilian, and in later chapters, Tacitus, Juvenal, Pliny the Younger, and Epictetus, an unbiased hearing, and enjoy them as if we had never heard that they belonged to a decadent period. In every epoch something is decaying and something is growing. In epigram, satire, the novel, history, and philosophy, the Silver Age marks the zenith of Roman literature, as it represents in realistic sculpture and mass architecture the climax of Roman art. The speech of the common man re-entered literature, diminishing inflections, relaxing syntax, and dropping final consonants with Gallic impertinence. About the middle of the 1st century, the Latin V, which had been pronounced like our W, and B, between vowels, were both softened into a sound like the English V. So, habere, to have, became in sound havere, and prepared for Latin avere and French avoir, while vinum, wine, began to approximate, by lazy slurring of the changing final consonant, the Italian vino and the French vin. The Latin language was preparing to mother Italian, Spanish, and French. It must be admitted that rhetoric had now grown at the expense of eloquence, grammar at the expense of poetry. Able men devoted themselves beyond precedent to studying the form, evolution, and niceties of the language, editing already classical texts, formulating the august rules of literary composition, forensic oratory, poetic meter, and prose rhythm. Claudius tried to reform the alphabet. Nero made poetry fashionable by his almost Japanese example. And the elder Seneca wrote manuals of rhetoric on the ground that eloquence gives to every power a double power. Without eloquence, only generals could rise in Rome, and even generals had to be orators. The mania for rhetoric seized all forms of literature. Poetry became rhetorical, prose became poetical, and Pliny himself wrote an eloquent page in the 6 volumes of his natural history. Men began to worry about the balance of their phrases and the melody of their clauses. Historians wrote declamations, philosophers itched for epigrams, and everyone wrote sententiae, concentrated pills of wisdom. All the polite world was writing poetry and reading it to friends in hired halls or theaters, at table, even, Martial complained, in the bath. Poets engaged in public competitions, won prizes, were feted by municipalities and crowned by emperors. Aristocrats and princes welcomed dedications or tributes and paid for them with dinners or denarii. The passion for poetry gave a pleasant aspect of amateur authorship to an age and city darkened with sexual license and periodic terror. Terror and poetry met in the life of Lucan. The older Seneca was his grandfather, the philosopher Seneca his uncle. Born in Cordoba in 39 and named Marcus Aeneas Lucanus, he was brought up in infancy to Rome and grew up in aristocratic circles where poetry and philosophy rivaled amorous and political intrigues as the foci of life. At 21, he competed in the Neronian Games with a poem in praise of Nero and won a prize. Seneca introduced him at court, and soon the poet and the emperor were bandying epics. Lucan made the mistake of winning first prize in a poetic contest with the prince. Nero ordered him to publish no more, and Lucan withdrew to avenge himself in private with a vigorous but rhetorical epic, Pharsalia, which viewed the civil war from the standpoint of the Pompeian aristocracy. Lucan is fair to Caesar and writes of him an illuminating phrase, Nil actum credens cum quid superesset agendum, thinking nothing done while anything remained to do. But the real hero of the book is the younger Cato, whom Lucan equals with the gods in a famous line, Victrix causa Deis placuit, sed victa Catoni. The winning cause pleased the gods, but the lost one pleased Cato. Lucan, too, loved a lost cause and died for it. He joined in the conspiracy to replace Nero with Piso, was arrested, broke down, he was only 26, and revealed the names of other conspirators, even we are told of his mother. When Nero confirmed his death sentence, he recovered his courage, summoned his friends to a feast, ate with them heartily, opened his veins, and recited his lines against despotism as he bled to death. This in 65. 2. Petronius. We are not certain, it is only the general opinion, that the Petronius whose Satyricon still finds many readers was the Caius Petronius who died by Nero's orders a year after Lucan. The book itself contains not a word to serve as a clue, and Tacitus, who describes the Arbiter Elegantiarum with pithy eloquence, makes no mention of the disreputable masterpiece. Some 40 epigrams are ascribed to a Petronius, including a line that almost sums up Lucretius. Primus in orbe deas fecit timor. It was fear that first in the world made gods. But these fragments, too, are silent about the author's identity. The Satyricon was a collection of satires, probably in 16 books, of which only the last 2 remain, themselves incomplete. They are saturae in the Latin sense of medleys, here of prose and verse, adventure and philosophy, gastronomy and venery. The form owes something to the satires of Menippus, a Syrian cynic who wrote in Gadara about 60 B.C., and to the Milesian tales, or love romances, that had become popular in the Hellenistic world. As all extant examples of these are later than Petronius, the Satyricon has the distinction of being the oldest known novel. It is hardly credible that an aristocratic lord of luxury and master of fine taste should have fathered a book so profusely vulgar as the Satyricon. All its active characters are plebeians, ex-slaves, or slaves, and all the scenes are of low life. Here the Augustan preoccupation of literature with the upper classes is violently ended. Encolpius, who tells the tale, is an adulterer, a homosexual, a liar, and a thief, and takes it for granted that all sensible men are the same. We had it understood between ourselves, he says of himself and his friend, that whenever opportunity came we would pilfer whatever we could lay our hands upon for the improvement of our common treasury. The story begins in a brothel where Encolpius meets Aeschylus, who has taken refuge there from a lecture on philosophy. Their escapades among the towns and trolls of southern Italy form the thread of the wandering narrative. Their rivalry for the handsome slave boy Gaetan unites and divides them in picaresque romance. At last they come to the house of the merchant Trimalchio, and the rest of the extant work is given over to describing the Cena Trimalchionis, the most astounding dinner in literature. Trimalchio is an ex-slave who has made a fortune, has bought enormous latifundia, and lives in parvenu luxury with the appointments of a palace and the atmosphere of a stew. His estates are so vast that a daily gazette must be written to keep him abreast of his earnings. He begs his guests to drink. "If the wine don't please you, I'll change it. I don't have to buy it, thank the gods. Everything here that makes your mouth water was produced on one of my country places, which I've never yet seen, but they tell me it's down Terracina and Tarentum way. I've got a notion to add Sicily to my other little holdings, so in case I want to go to Africa, I'll be able to sail along my own coasts. When it comes to silver, I'm a connoisseur. I have goblets as big as wine jars. I own 1,000 bowls that Mummius left to my patron. I buy cheap and sell dear. Others may have different ideas." He is a kindly fellow withal. He shouts at his slaves, but he pardons them readily. He has so many that only 1/10 of them know him by sight. "Slaves are men," he says, generously remembering his origin. "They sucked the same milk that we did, and mine will drink the water of freedom if they live." To prove his intentions, he has his will brought in and reads it to his guests. It includes specifications for his epitaph, which is to end with the proud claim that he grew rich from little, left 30 million sesterces, and never heard a philosopher. 40 pages describe the dinner. A few sentences will convey its aroma. There was a circular tray around which were displayed the signs of the zodiac, and upon each sign the caterer had placed the food best in keeping with it. Ram's vetches on Aries, beef on Taurus, the womb of an unfarrowed sow on Virgo, on Libra, a balance holding a tart in one pan and a cake in the other. 4 dancers ran into music and removed the upper part of the tray. Beneath it, stuffed capons and sows' bellies, and in the middle a hare. At the corners, 4 figures of Marsyas spouted from their bladders a highly spiced sauce upon fish which were swimming about. A tray followed on which was served a wild boar. From its tusks hung baskets loaded with dates. Around it were little suckling pigs made of pastry. When the carver plunged his knife into the boar's side, thrushes flew out, 1 for each guest. 3 white hogs walk into the room, and the guests choose which one they will have cooked for them. While they eat, the winning hog is roasted. Soon it re-enters. When it is carved, sausages and meat puddings emerge from its belly. When the dessert arrives, Encolpius has no stomach for it, but Trimalchio urges his guests onward by assuring them that the dessert has been made entirely out of a hog. A hoop is lowered from the ceiling, bringing to each diner an alabaster jar filled with perfume, while slaves replenish empty glasses with ancient wines. Trimalchio gets drunk and makes love to a boy. His fat wife protests, and he throws a cup at her head. "This Syrian dancing whore," he says of her, "has a poor memory. I took her off the auction block and made her a woman, and now she puffs herself up like a frog. But that's the way it is. If you're born in an attic, you can't sleep in a palace." And he bids his major domo keep her statue off his tomb, else I'll be nagged even after I'm dead. It is a powerful and savage satire, realistic only in its details and probably true of only a small segment of Roman life. If Nero's Petronius wrote it, we must count it the merciless caricature of the nouveau riche freedman by a patrician who had never earned his keep. There is no mercy in the book, no tenderness, no ideal. Immorality and corruption are taken for granted, and the life of the underworld is presented with gusto, without indignation and without comment. Here the gutter flows directly into classic literature, bringing its own judgments and taste, its own lusty vocabulary and hilarious vitality. Sometimes the story rises to those sublime heights of nonsense, obscenity, and vituperation which crown the epic of Gargantua and Pantagruel. Apuleius's golden ass would follow in its steps. Gil Blas, 17 centuries later, would rival it. Tristram Shandy and Tom Jones would continue its meandering tradition. It is the strangest book in the literature of Rome. 3. The Philosophers. In this loose and complex age, when freedom was so limited and life was so free, philosophy flourished alongside of sensuality, and the two were not above joining hands. The decay of the native religion had left a moral vacuum which philosophy sought to fill. Parents sent their sons, and themselves often went, to hear the lectures of men who offered to provide a rational code of civilized conduct, or a formal dress for naked desire. Those who could afford it paid philosophers to live with them, partly as educators, partly as spiritual counselors, partly as learned company, So Augustus had Arius, consulted him on almost everything, and for his sake, if we may believe a ruler, was lenient to Alexandria. When Drusus died, Livia called in her husband's philosopher, so Seneca phrases it, to help her bear her grief. Nero, Trajan, and of course Aurelius had philosophers residing with them at court, as kings have chaplains now. In their last moments, men would summon philosophers to chart their passing, as centuries later they would ask for a priest. The public never forgave these teachers of wisdom for taking salaries or fees. Philosophy was esteemed a sufficient substitute for food and drink, and philosophers who had a less exalted opinion of their profession were the butt of popular jokes, of Quintilian's criticism, of Lucian's satire, and of imperial hostility. Many of them deserved it, for they put on the philosopher's coarse cloak and grew a profound beard to give a learned front to gluttony, avarice, and vanity. A short survey of life, says a character in Lucian, had convinced me of the absurdity and meanness that pervade all worldly purposes. In this state of mind, the best I could think of was to get at the truth of it all from the philosophers. So I selected the best of them, if solemnity of visage, pallor of complexion, and length of beard are a criterion. I placed myself in their hands. For a considerable sum down, and more to be paid when they had perfected me in wisdom, I was to be instructed in the order of the universe. Unfortunately, so far from dispelling my previous ignorance, they perplexed me more and more with their daily drenches of beginnings and ends, atoms and voids, matters and forms. My greatest difficulty was that, though they differed among themselves and all they said was full of contradictions, they expected me to believe them, each pulling me in his own direction. Often one of them could not tell you correctly the number of miles from Megara to Athens, but had no hesitation about the distance in feet from the sun to the moon. Most of the Roman philosophers followed the Stoic creed. The Epicureans were too busy pursuing wine, woman, and food to have much time for theory. Here and there in Rome were mendicant preachers of the Cynic philosophy, ignoring speculation and calling men to a simple and soapless life. They acceded to the popular demand that philosophers should be poor, and were in consequence the least respected of the schools. Seneca, however, made one of them his intimate friend. "Why should I not hold Demetrius in high esteem?" he asked. "I have found that he lacks nothing." And the millionaire sage marveled when the nearly naked cynic refused a gift of 200,000 sesterces from Caligula. Since the Roman Stoic was a man of action rather than of contemplation, he eschewed metaphysics as a hopeless quest, and sought in Stoicism a philosophy of conduct that would support human decency, family unity, and social order independently of supernatural surveillance and command. The essence of his code was self-control. He would subordinate passion to reason and train his will to desire nothing that would make his peace of soul contingent upon external goods. In politics, he would recognize the universal brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. At the same time, he would love his country and hold himself ready to die at any time to avert its disgrace or his own. Life itself was always to remain within his choice. He was free to leave it whenever it should become an evil rather than a boon. A man's conscience was to be higher than any law. Monarchy was a sad necessity for the rule of wide and diverse realms, but to kill a despot was an excellent thing. Roman Stoicism had at first profited from the Principate. The limitations on political freedom had driven men from the Forum to the study, and had inclined the finest of them to a philosophy that made the self-controlled subject more sovereign than the impassioned king. The government did not check freedom of thought or speech so long as these made no public attack upon the emperor, his family, or the official gods. But when the professors and their senatorial patrons began to denounce tyranny, there arose between philosophy and autocracy a war that lasted till the adoptive emperors united them on the throne. When Nero ordered Thracia to die in 65, he at the same time exiled Thracia's friend Musonius Rufus, the most sincere and consistent of the Stoic philosophers in first-century Rome. Rufus had defined philosophy as inquiry into right conduct and had taken his quest seriously. He denounced concubinage despite its legality, and demanded of men the same standard of sexual morality that they required of women. Sexual relations, said this ancient Tolstoyan, were permissible only in marriage and for procreation. He believed in equal educational opportunities for both sexes, and welcomed women to his lectures, but he bade them seek from education and philosophy the means of perfecting themselves as women. Slaves, too, attended his classes. One of them, Epictetus, honored his teacher by surpassing him. When civil war flared in Rome after Nero's death, Musonius went out to the attacking army and lectured it on the blessings of peace and the horrors of war. Antonius's troops laughed at him and resumed the ultimate arbitrament. Vespasian, in expelling the philosophers from Rome, accepted Rufus, but he kept his concubines. 4. Seneca. The Stoic philosophy found its most doubtful expression in the life, its most perfect expression in the writings, of Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Born at Cordoba about 4 B.C., he was soon taken to Rome and received all the education available there. He imbibed rhetoric from his father, Stoicism from Attalus, Pythagoreanism from Sotion, and practical politics from his aunt's husband, the Roman governor of Egypt. He tried vegetarianism for a year, then gave it up, but remained always abstemious in food and drink. He was a millionaire in his surroundings rather than in his habits. He suffered so much from asthma and weak lungs that he often contemplated suicide. He practiced law and was chosen quaestor about AD 33. 2 years later he married Pompeia Paulina, with whom he lived in remarkable continuity until his death. On inheriting his father's fortune, he abandoned the law and indulged himself in writing. When Cremutius Cordus was forced by Caligula to kill himself in 40, Seneca addressed to Cordus's daughter Marcia a consolatio, an essay of condolence which was a regularly practiced form in the schools of rhetoric and philosophy. Caligula wished to have him executed for his impertinence, but Seneca's friends saved his life by arguing that he would presently die of consumption in any case. Soon afterward, Claudius accused him of improper relations with Julia, daughter of Germanicus. The Senate condemned him to death, but Claudius commuted this to exile in Corsica. On that rugged isle, amid a population as primitive as in Ovid's Tomi, the philosopher spent 8 lonely years, from 41 to 49. At first he took his misfortune with true Stoic calm, and comforted his mother with a touching consolatio ad Helviam. But as the bitter years crawled on, his spirit broke, and he addressed to Claudius's secretary a consolatio ad Polybium in a humble appeal for pardon. When this failed, he tried to dull his sufferings by composing tragedies. These strange productions, in which almost every character is an orator, were probably intended for the study rather than the stage. We do not hear of any of them being played. At most, some brilliant episodes or resounding speeches were put to music and acted by a mime. The gentle philosopher incarnadines the stage with violence, as if he would rival in the theater the blood feasts of the games. Despite these heroic efforts, he is too much of a thinker to be a good dramatist. He prefers ideas to men and loses no chance for reflection, sentiment, or epigram. His plays contain some fine lines, but for the rest they may be forgotten with impunity. It should be added, however, that many good judges have not agreed with this verdict. Scaliger, lord of Renaissance critics, preferred Seneca to Euripides. When ancient literature came back to life, it was Seneca who served as model for the first dramas in modern speech. From him came the classic form and unities that marked the plays of Corneille and Racine and dominated the French stage till the 19th century. In England, which felt his influence less, the translation of Seneca's dramas by Heywood in 1559 gave an exemplar to the first English tragedy, Gorboduc, and left its mark on Shakespeare. In 48, the younger Agrippina replaced Messalina in power over Claudius and Rome. Anxious to turn her 11-year-old son Nero into an Alexander, she looked about for an Aristotle and found him in Corsica. She had Seneca recalled and restored to his seat in the Senate. For 5 years he tutored the youth, and for 5 more he guided the emperor and the state. During this decade he wrote for the edification of Nero and sundry some genial expositions of the Stoic philosophy, on anger, on the brevity of life, on the tranquility of the soul, on clemency, on the happy life, on the constancy of the sage, on benefits, on providence. These formal treatises do not show him at his best. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.